Act is exactly the same as the title of Bill number 97, which is also titled an Act to amend Chapter 293, the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act, which just goes to prove my honourable colleague from Cape Breton North's position, which was that there are some that obviously have come forward in this session which, well, not taking away their merit or their value, could obviously have been combined. In this case, we're actually amending the exact same act. Very similar effect, actually, of the two acts, which is very interesting, Mr. Speaker. I can remember not that long ago taking my driver's test. Well, I guess it was a long time ago now, 20 years ago, or yeah, 20 years ago. And I remember studying. I remember studying the driver's handbook at the time on the plane coming back to visit my family in the UK. And one of the things that you always paid a lot of attention to was what were the things that were going to cause you to lose your license, or what were the things that were going to cause you not to get a license in the first place. And that, of course, is what this bill deals with in amending Section 282 in particular, actually, is the section it issues. And I was taking a look earlier today at the current driver's handbook, and of course, Section 1 of that book, page 28, the first thing it does is talk about the demerit points in the section of the Motor Vehicle Act in which it determines. So I thought I might take some time and go through what some of those points are, and so that we know where you might get the points taken off and where you might not. There might be some things that people could learn here while we're here. So, Mr. Speaker, of course, there appear to be basically three different ways you can get demerit points off in 2 points, 4 points, or 6 points. Obviously, somebody liked even numbers when they wrote the act. The fact is that you will not, I'll focus on the ones that are 4 or 2 for the moment, because that's really where this is important. According to the explanatory note in this bill, the registrar will not issue a warning notice when 4 or more points are issued on the driver's abstract. So, of course, you would get 4. You would see 4 points for improper passing, for example, which is Section 114 and 115 of the Motor Vehicle Act, speeding in excess of the speed limit, which is Section 102 of the Motor Vehicle Act, speeding in excess of the posted limit in a school area, which, interestingly enough, is a much higher fine, which is Section 103. Speeding in excess of the posted limit by 31 kilometers an hour or more, and I think we all read in the news the other day, I believe it was up near Wentworth, somebody was stopped for going at 182 kilometers an hour, I believe was the speed, and that also has 4 points. Mr. Speaker, failing to yield to a pedestrian is 4 points, and I might take a moment just to discuss that. That, of course, deals with crosswalks, and I think we'll all remember the bill that I have before the House dealing with crosswalk flags. And let me digress for a moment and just talk about that issue, which you could actually get 4 points on your license for failing to do. It's interesting to note that in the past month, 6 additional U.S. jurisdictions have now implemented crosswalk flags as part of their statewide program for crosswalk safety. I find that interesting. I know the minister was very supportive of crosswalk flags, and I appreciate that. The Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, not so supportive of the bill, but I think it was because he didn't feel that the bill was necessary to have those go into place. And I know his the deputy minister of that department has indicated in a letter just this week, in fact, that they would be pleased to see them on provincial roads, and I know that there's now an effort. In fact, in Port Williams, there's going to be a meeting on crosswalk flags in the next couple of weeks where Port Williams may be implementing crosswalk flags. I'm not exactly sure which riding Port Williams is in off the top of my head, but sometimes not quite sure where the line is on some of those boundaries. Mr. Speaker, it goes on to number 4, which is failing to, or another 4.1 is failing to obey a traffic control person. And of course, we know how serious that can be. That not only applies to police officers, but of course at construction sites and so forth. And we know that there are men and women who you know, and not to speak too lightly of it, they do put their lives on the line in some cases in a very dangerous situation, often on very high-speed roads, and I commend this and previous governments for actually changing the rules and strengthening them around passing both construction sites and so forth. Mr. Speaker, when I actually, in fact, misled the House when I said there was only even-numbered ones. There is actually one that is 3 points, which is speeding in excess of the posted limit between 16 and 30 kilometres an hour inclusive. You know, Mr. Speaker, speeding is, of course, very important, and I know that the government has been lobbied by the municipalities to consider allowing a lower speed limit, a speed limit of 30 kilometres an hour where appropriate in residential areas. I know they do that in Ontario, and of course that too would impact the number of points and how that is addressed by the House. The sections, there are many ways though, and I think this is what we need to understand with what 4 points can mean to somebody, where they may get a ticket and not worry about it because it's 2 points, and then they may just accumulate these over time. We the minister for, or the member for Cape Breton North implied that he's had a few run-ins, I guess, where maybe he was on his way very quickly to places and may have accumulated some points. Of course, he would never drive to the left of the center line, I'm sure. We're not allowed, which would only get him 2 points. Now, I'm intrigued by one of the ones that you can get under Section 181, which is operating a motor vehicle without adequate brakes. And I have to assume that you only get 2 points for that because you probably don't end up too well once they figure out that you're operating your motor vehicle without adequate brakes. Mr. Speaker, failing to obey traffic signs or signals or yield the right-of-way, which we see examples of all the time if it's caught, is of course also just 2 points. There's a number of offences which yield 2 points. Offences involving motor vehicles under sections 70, 70A, 70B, 75, 107, 111, 112, 117, 118, 119, 120, 123, and a whole bunch of other ones that all result in just a 2 point. Now, here's where it becomes significant, and if I understood the minister correct, this would only apply to full licensed people, not newly licensed drivers and so forth. So there is a chart, in referring again back to the driver's handbook prepared by Service Nova Scotia, where the learner's stage, at the learner's stage, there was nothing you would ever got a warning letter for before anyways, Mr. Speaker. At 2 points, so in fact any infraction, any ticket at all, you would end up with, being required to come in for an interview. And if you're required to come in for an interview with a driver enhancement officer, they actually will fully test you again at that point. And I think that's probably a misunderstanding by a lot of people, is that they assume that they come in for an interview, they just want to talk to you about your driving and your driving ability and so forth. Well, in fact, that will also include a road test. And my experience is that many of the motor vehicle testers or the driver enhancement officers are quite picky, as they should be. We don't, I certainly don't criticize them for that. That is their job. And I can remember that when I took my test, I took one left turn a little bit too tight, and I still passed. But I think you're allowed to get 2 points taken off on your test at the time, and I had 1 for that. And so that would require retesting. Of course, the 4 points for a learner stage, which used to result in a letter at other stages, actually results in a 6-month suspension. For newly licensed drivers, will still, as I understand it, get a warning letter at 2 points, as they should. At 4 points, they actually have to come in for another test. And again, as I said, that test can be picky sometimes and can be very difficult. Actually, it'd be interesting to see if we made them all do tests in standard vehicles with standard transmissions. Because I only actually got to learn a standard vehicle a few years ago, and I still don't own one, but I certainly learned how to drive that. And if everybody did their driver's test in a standard, that would make it particularly interesting, especially if they started them out on Duke Street. And 6 points results in a 6-month suspension. For all others, and that's really what we're talking about here, Mr. Speaker, is we're talking about all other drivers. We're talking about drivers who are fully licensed. We're talking about drivers young and old. They used to get a warning letter at 4 points. Now, the thing about getting a warning letter at 4 points is that it did provide people the opportunity to be aware that they had accumulated a number of points, especially if there was just a couple of maybe two-point infractions, for example. And I think probably the way that the explanatory note in this bill is worded may be a bit misleading, and I don't, the minister I know wouldn't have written this, but it says that you would not be issued a warning notice when 4 or more points are entered on a person's driver's record, when in fact, of course, you would still going to get that letter at 6 points to come in for an interview and be retested. You can actually, though, however, end up with quite a combination of offences before you get a 6-month suspension. And let's just consider that for a moment. You could operate your vehicle without brakes or appropriate brakes. You could drive over the center line, fail to yield to traffic, get a speeding ticket, and do any one of the offenses in sections 70, 70A, 70B, 75, 107, 111, 112, 117, 118, 119, 120, 123, 164, 165, 169, 175, 2 and 3, 175, 4, 178, or 185. You could do all of those things and still not actually end up with a 6-month suspension. Adds up pretty good, doesn't it? I can see that the Speaker is considering all the infractions he can get without losing his license. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think that it's important to understand exactly where this can go. One of the directions that I think that the minister may wish to consider, at least now or maybe in the future, is I think it's important for people in all parts of Nova Scotia to have access to their driver's abstract, to know where they're at. To know where especially if they're, for example, I've had over the past year and a half or so since I've been a member of this legislature, as I'm sure other, especially urban members have had, I've had a number of cab drivers come in who have found that they've ended up with a 6-month suspension, and in fairness, they probably should have known they were getting to that point, and they did, they did violate the act, so it's not a debate about that, but for folks, especially in the transportation industry like that, it would probably be valuable for them to be able to go online and be able to look at their abstract somehow. And that's particularly important because not everybody in Nova Scotia has access, easy access to an Access Nova Scotia office. And in fairness, it's really impractical to expect that there's going to be an Access Nova Scotia office in every single community in the province. That would get outrageously expensive, I'm sure. Mr. Speaker, but it would be, but with the expansion of internet and high-speed internet, and hopefully that will be, everybody in Nova Scotia will in fact have access to that eventually. I know that the program is largely rolled out, but there's still a number of people that don't have access, that there would be the ability for people to check their own abstracts over time. Mr. Speaker, it's interesting also to look at what the impact is in that same section that this Act is amending when you look at what happens if people refuse to attend the interviews when they're requested by the registrar. And so Section 282, which this Act deals with, also deals with that issue of what happens if you don't actually go and speak to or you don't turn up for the interview. So if you fail to attend or participate in the interviews when requested, the registrar may suspend his or her license, or the privilege of obtaining a license until such time as that you actually participate. And I almost wonder whether there would have been merit in saying, well, maybe that should be an automatic 6-month suspension if you can't be bothered to show up for the interview. You've obviously have enough convictions that it's deemed that you should be retested. And if you don't show up, the penalty is that the registrar may, which seems to leave quite a bit of discretion. Obviously, we would want some discretion in the case of if there was a hospitalization or a family emergency or a situation such as that. But I think that we very much need to consider what that could be. Mr. Speaker, the suspension that can be done as a result of that, when 10, we talked about what happens at 10 points, which I think is pertinent to this bill, particularly when we're talking about how are we changing the penalties for different numbers of demerit points. When 10 or more points are entered on the record of a person according to the Act, quote, in respect of the convictions for violation of this Act entered against him within a period of 24 months, the registrar shall suspend the driver's license or the privilege of obtaining a driver's license for a period of 6 months. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting that the bill actually uses him all the way through, and I should actually maybe check the definitions at the beginning to ensure that that is appropriately defined so as to be gender neutral. Because I'm not actually sure that it is, actually, now that I say that. It's in the Interpretation Act. Thank you to the member for Halifax Fairview, who is obviously, he's just trying to prove that he's actually listening to this. Mr. Speaker, I have to be honest, I'm not sure that I'm listening to myself, so I'm impressed. I'm not sure, I'm really impressed. I'm really impressed that the minister or that the member for Halifax Fairview is listening, because I really appreciate that. I'm touched. Mr. Oh my. You know, Mr. Speaker, let me just add as an aside that let's just be glad that the rules around filibustering are not the same as they're in the U.S. Congress, where they can get up and they can actually like read cookbooks if they want or anything. At least I'll try to stay on the topic of the bill. So continuing on, Mr. Speaker, on my observations on the Motor Vehicle Act and Section 282 in particular. That was amusing. It's interesting that Section 7 of the Motor Vehicle Act allows a suspension of the driver's license should not be made until 30 days after the date of conviction. Now, there was always and I have to assume that this is an urban myth, but there was always this rumor that when you got a speeding ticket and you had that 2-week or 7-day suspension, that in fact, one of the things that you were able to do is that you were able to choose when you served that week. And I'm not sure if that's actually in the Act or whether that became an urban myth or what happened there, but it's interesting here that the thing here is that it shall not be made until 30 days after the date of conviction that increase the total number of points entered into the record of 10 or more points, or the appeal is dismissed or discontinued, or the driver notifies that they're not appealing the conviction. And so the interesting thing about that to me is that, you know, you can actually end up going through the whole process and not serving your conviction until much later when, you know, maybe at some point we want to give the registrar some flexibility in allowing that. Somebody may not be worried about the 30 days or the 6 months that they can't drive. I think most people would be worried, but they may be more worried about the points in terms of their insurance and so forth. So they may wish to appeal, but at the same time start serving their sentence right away. And we see that with actually criminal convictions sometimes, where somebody will start serving they'll report to start serving their sentence while their appeal goes on. I think Martha Stewart did that actually. There's a way to bring Martha Stewart into a debate on Motor Vehicle Act. I think, Mr. Speaker, it's interesting when you look at this act that I think there is, I really do believe there is merit in the 16 words of this act. I think that there is, or this bill, I'm sorry, it's not an act until it becomes law. I do wonder why we have at least 2 acts with the exact same title, of course, that maybe could have been combined. We supported the other one, and no doubt we will ultimately support this as well. I would like the minister and her department over time to look at the issue, though, of how people in Nova Scotia, across Nova Scotia, can actually have access to their record without more easily, without going into the having to go into the Access Nova Scotia office. We're in a we can use the phone. There, see, I learned something. Thank you to the Minister of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations, who tells me you can use the phone to find out about your record, which is something I didn't know. So I appreciate that. Thank you. This is very, because I think it's very important that people know this sort of thing and know that they can access their record. And granted, there are people that will never, ever, ever have to access their driver's abstract, and there will be a few people that will never get a ticket. In fact, the only ticket that I ever got that got points was just a couple of years after I got my driver's license, and it was driving on the old Wentworth Highway before they built the Cobequid Pass. And it was pouring down rain in the middle of the night. I was working for Fisheries and Oceans at the time, and I was at a meeting in Fredericton and had to get to a meeting in Yarmouth yeah, and believe me, that is a really, and it was before they built the highway in Fredericton too, the faster highway in Fredericton too. So you can imagine how long this drive was at that point. And it was pouring down rain, and it was almost freezing rain because it was the winter, and we'd had a regional fisheries meeting and I don't know why it was in Fredericton, but the guys had come up from St. Andrews, and then I was going to Yarmouth to meet with a fishermen's organization, the Maritime Fishermen's Union, I think it was at the time. In fact, one of the people I was meeting with at the time later was Arthur Bull, who later became the NDP federal candidate in down the Digby part of the world, a good guy, and somebody I still keep in touch with periodically to this day, and actually was on a whole side note. Also, I believe, got involved in the quarry fight up there, and I was up there during the fight against the American quarry that wanted to come in. So a fine gentleman, and I met him back in his Maritime Fishermen Union days. I'm pretty sure that was the one that he was involved in. In any case, that was my first speeding ticket, which was the point of that story, and it was the only one I've had, thankfully. And Mr. Speaker, it was in a rental car. And which brings me to another issue on this, that I have actually Oh, what color was it? I don't know what color. I have no idea what color it was. But it does actually bring me to another point, because like most people, I've been stopped at routine stops. And until recently, my previous vehicle was actually registered to the company that I had, because most members know I had a small business for a number of years. And the interesting thing about that was that really confused the RCMP officer that stopped me on a stop a couple of years ago, because he couldn't, when he punched my registration for my car into the computer, it didn't come up with me as the owner, it came up with my company name, and he wondered whether maybe I had stolen the car, because of course I didn't have rental documents either, and the member for Cape Breton North says I look a bit shady. So in any case, so when I got my new car, and obviously I got into this, and well, it's okay. I had interestingly enough, when I effectively rolled up the company, or sort of put it on hold to get into this crazy game, yeah, politics is a crazy game. I have no problem saying that. Theater at its best. The thing is that I actually ended up making sure I registered my car in my own name to avoid those problems, and it was actually the police officer had recommended it, because I was surprised that caused him some confusion, but it actually lengthened the amount of time to write his ticket. And when it comes to, and that's no fun, because you're already upset that you've been stopped. And actually, I should note, actually, Mr. Speaker, that when it comes to writing tickets and dealing with this sort of issue, that I know that the Minister of Justice has actually introduced a bill that would allow, that clears up an issue around electronic SOTs. I think it was, I assume it was the Minister of Justice that introduced that. And one of the things that that this department could also be moving ahead for that would have a real impact is, while that actually allows the police officer to swipe your driver's license, we still don't have swipeable vehicle registrations, and we haven't, and in the Minister of Finance's review of the Insurance Act, we don't have swipeable insurance cards. And if we had all three of those things, the act that the Minister of Justice was introducing, combined with changes to this section of the Motor Vehicle Act, would actually allow, would actually almost eliminate errors in the issuance of tickets, because there would be no transcribing errors, because the other act will allow a swiping of a driver's license, which will populate that part of the electronic ticket. But because they can't swipe either the insurance or the vehicle registration, they actually won't be able to do that. And I will speak more on that when we get to that act later, which I think is coming up a bit later. Or that bill, I'm sorry, which is coming up much later. In fact, I think by my estimate, at least 16 hours from now at this point. So, Mr. Speaker, getting back to the Act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989 of the Motor Vehicle Act, I would like to say that the 16 words that make up this Act do have some impact. They certainly do, and I would like to encourage the minister that as tickets are redesigned, don't fall asleep. When the tickets are redesigned, that they should indicate on the back that warning letters are no longer sent, except for new drivers, because I think that's important. I think it's important that we let people know, because there will be people who are habitual offenders, and it's a shame that there are some of those around who will not be getting a warning letter. And so with that, I would like to look at the going back to the Young Drivers book again. I'd like to talk about some of the items that get you 6 points, because let's keep in mind that you're going to get a 6 point, you're going to get a ticket that has 6 demerit points, and you're now going to be called directly in for an interview. And so those, and a retest, I might add. And so this sort of information I think is very important to point out. It's good. No, it's a good thing. Oh, it could. Does it really say could? No, actually, just so the minister knows, if it is a could, then they need to amend their driver's license book, because actually, Mr. Speaker, what it actually says, the wording is, you will be fully tested again. It says, if you are required to come in for an interview with a driver enhancement officer, you will be fully tested again, including a road test. So that may be an error in the driver's handbook. And
would the honourable member allow an introduction?
Oh yeah, absolutely, most certainly, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable the member for Pictou East on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure for me to rise in this House and to introduce a longtime friend from the fishing industry, a person who has been involved in that industry for over 30 years. He is a great leader in the fishing industry and a great Cabretner. He's been involved in leadership in the crab fishery and the lobster fishery and all aspects of the fishery. And I'd like Brian Adams from Red River outside of Pleasant Bay to stand and receive the warm welcome of the House.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Oh, thank you very much, and I actually appreciate that opportunity to sit down for a second. And I hope that our guest is enjoying our very detailed debate on 16 words being proposed to adjust the Motor Vehicle Act. So this, I'm going to assume this is the most recent one, because I got it from the library, our legislative librarian, but it may not be. A copy of the your driver's license handbook. And so actually, I think if I was the minister, I might leave it as you will be fully tested, because at least it's a good way to scare people and think that they are definitely going to get a road test. And why shouldn't they get a road test for that matter, if they have to go in for an interview? In fact, maybe they should get a road test while they're trying to manipulate a GPS in the car. That would be unsafe, you're right. Which actually brings up another point. I don't know if the minister has done this, but I know some members of the other benches have the Insurance Bureau's road testing. Yeah, the minister has done that, and it's actually very interesting. Of course, I think we all intuitively know, as the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal has said, that using a cell phone or other distractions is dangerous, and I think we all know that intuitively and agree. But once you've actually sat in the Insurance Bureau's vehicle that actually simulates some of that, it's actually amazing, the impact and the distractions. It's actually much more difficult than even I thought, and I don't think you realize that, because I can remember before it was the law that you couldn't talk on the cell phone, and I usually had a headset anyways, but you know, I did it sometimes, like we all did, and most of the time, I don't think there's too many people in the house that had never done it. And it was interesting because you really see the impact of that, and it would be interesting at some point to look at the statistics and whether there has actually been a change in the number of accidents or that as a result of this legislation, and I hope there has been. I would think there have. Now if we can just get people to stop talking on cell phones on bicycles, that would be even better, because I saw that the other day. I was absolutely shocked. I was flabbergasted. Or the worst one, actually worse than that, is people that listen to their iPods while they're biking on the road. Like, I'm sorry, but you want something that should be outlawed. Using your iPod on your bicycle on the road? There, another part of the Motor Vehicle Act. Or the leader of the third party says using your laptop, which that would be, I don't know, I think I'd be impressed to see that. Yeah, that could be a show in the Busker Festival. Which incidentally, the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage should try to find a way to get money for. Mr. Speaker, it is interesting that, you know, I think this bill is it is important. It does have merit. I'd be interested to know, and I unfortunately missed the minister's opening remarks at second reading, and I do apologize to the minister for that, but I'd be interested to know whether the department has actually worked out any cost savings from that, because or projected cost savings, because I'm sure there are some, and as there should be. And I think it's more that the member for Clare talked about, you know, 50 cents, but I'm sure it's more than that, because there's overhead costs and processing and last time I checked, the stamp isn't 50 cents anyways. I think it's a little bit more than that. It's 54 or 55, 54 plus. No, I think that includes HST. We'll have to find out. It's definitely, it's lots. You know, on the issue of stamps, let me point out that I actually thought that I often wondered why we were more expensive in Canada to mail a letter than the States, and then I learned last week that the U.S. Postal Service is running a $1.8 billion deficit, so that would be why. It is cheaper to mail a letter in the U.S. So that's my other useless fact for the day. Mr. Speaker, well, Mr. Speaker, continuing on with section... Yeah, all right. Continuing on with Section 282 of the Motor Vehicle Act, which we will all know really well very shortly. It is up to the registrar of the motor vehicles to reinstate driver's licenses, and I would like to, when that comes from some of these points or whatever the case may be, and Mr. Speaker, I would actually like to point out the fact that sometimes there can be delays in the court in getting information through, and hopefully that as we move to more and more electronic systems, some of that can be in fact cleaned up. One of the things that often troubles me is when people come into my office, and there's not a lot, I don't want to suggest there's hundreds of them come in, but you know, being in an urban riding, you get the cab drivers, and I think if you're if you're anybody that your job is to be driving all day and all the time, you're more likely to have more infractions just by virtue of the fact that you're out on the road all the time. And you know, I've had a couple of them where, you know, things got caught up in the courts, and so their suspension didn't start until later, and you know, that obviously can cause a financial impact. And it would be interesting. I'd be interested to know actually whether at any point in the past decade or so, the registrar has ever looked at opportunities for mild infractions, obviously ones where there's no injury or nothing that we would, nothing like alcohol or texting or things like that, that there might be alternative sentencing options. And obviously a court can, I guess, always issue that. But Mr. Speaker, obviously people who get a lot of convictions would be happy to know that after 24 months from the date of a conviction, that the registrar deducts from the record the number of points entered in respect to that. Now, in going through that, I had always thought, and maybe I just haven't got to that section yet, that if you had a subsequent conviction within the 24 months that you actually wouldn't, that the original points wouldn't be lost. So it actually had to be 24 months clear and free of any conviction. So that may have been removed at some time, or maybe it's elsewhere in another section of the Act. And interestingly, when now this is where it actually does get very interesting with respect to getting a letter, is that in Section 9 of 282 of the Act, it says when the driver's license or privilege of obtaining a driver's license of that person has been suspended and the period of suspension has expired, the registrar shall remove from the record all the points. And that's what I was just talking about. But then it says, any driver's license or renewal thereof issued to a person after the expiration of a period of suspension shall be a probationary license for 12 months. And so, when we go back to our young driver's book here, yes, absolutely. Got the whole book over there. The question is, I'm unclear whether that makes you the equivalent of a newly licensed driver, in which case you will still now get a warning letter at 2 points. Because if we remember from my earlier remarks, a newly licensed driver's license, boy, that's a mouthful, gets ends up with a warning letter at 2 points. So when we get to 2 points, you get a warning license if you're a newly licensed driver. But what happened, it doesn't address the issue of probationary license, and in fact, it says all others. And then it talks about the 4, 6, and 10, and we know that 4 is now going to disappear. So, and I realize that this isn't written, the driver's handbook isn't written in legalese, and we're probably thankful for that. But what I would be interested to know is whether a probationary license is in fact considered all others, or whether that is the equivalent of a newly licensed driver's license. Because if it's a newly licensed driver's license, you are going to get a warning letter after your first infraction again, which probably actually makes some sense. And I think many members of the House would agree that there's probably some sense, and if someone has had a suspension, that in fact they should probably, there's probably some merit in them getting a letter at 2 points, just to say, listen, you know, you had that infraction where you lost your license, and let's not forget it took 10 points to get that infraction, that now you're going to get a letter again at 2 points. That would make some sense, but I'm unclear whether a probationary license under Section 10 of 282 is in fact an all others license or a newly licensed driver's license. So, and I don't actually know the answer to that, believe it or not. But I'm sure that the minister would like to stand up for an hour or so and explain that, which give me a bit of a break, right? You know, I won't repeat what the member for Cape Breton North said, so, but the minister will be happy it was against me and not her. You know, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to, in moving towards wrapping up some of my remarks, I would like to. I'm getting there.
Take your time. I think there's a couple of pages you didn't cover.
I just like to, it's like writing an essay. When you tell people how to write an essay, you have your introduction, you have the body of the essay, and then you have the end of the essay, the conclusion. And the worst thing that students can ever do, is to start the conclusion in conclusion, right? And then they start for the next like 5 or 6 pages, right? So moving along, for the benefit of the member for Halifax Fairview, towards the conclusion of my remarks, which is really just a way to say that whoever's speaking next better get ready. You see that? It worked. Thank you. And may I just say that the decorum is so much better today than it has been in some other days, and it's always important that we respect the views of people on different sides of the House, because we are all here for the same purpose, and today's purpose is to decide about 16 words in the Motor Vehicle Act. And in fact, actually, we're not even deciding about 16 words in the Motor Vehicle Act. We are actually talking about repealing number 3, which is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 8, 9, 20, 20. We're actually talking about removing 21 words from the Motor Vehicle Act just for those who are interested. And the interesting, it's worth noting that actually that the Act, this appeal, I don't know whether it matters to the Legislative Council folks who get sort of concerned about this sort of stuff, but not in this Act is a renumbering of the remaining sections. And normally Legislative Council will require the renumbering of the remaining portion of that section, which this doesn't do, which means now that the section will go 1, 2, 4, which will be terribly confusing to people, I'm sure. So maybe we do need to move an amendment later, and we can do 20 hours on that. Oh, don't worry, we know. Don't worry, we already know that. Mr. Speaker, the member for Halifax Fairview was kindly reminding us how to filibuster in Committee of the Whole, which I appreciate, but I don't really understand his approach to reminding us. But oh, well, thank you. But it would be nicer if you renumbered it. It always drives me nuts when there's all kinds of redundant stuff in the Act. And Mr. Speaker, it's I would like to actually know how much of any legislature, and this, listen, housekeeping stuff is important, and I don't want to belittle the fact that it is important, because it really is. I'd be interested to know, though, for any legislative session in any parliament, how much of the time is actually taken up, or how many of the bills are actually of a housekeeping nature like this, because I'm sure that there's a lot of them. You have to update things. There was always the urban myth, or at least I assume it's an urban myth, that there was some law in the provincial books that you could walk through somebody's property carrying a fishing pole. I assume that actually doesn't exist, but that was always the rumor growing up. But the other, just a couple weeks ago, the Minister for Natural Resources, or it might have been in his agriculture portfolio, had the Merchandising Act remove that one, which was pretty funny that it was still on the books. There's a lot of those, and I always thought, even in my previous political life, that there should have been a committee that's whole job was really just to look at what acts just needed to be gotten rid of, which I think actually has a lot of value. And when you look at an act which, when printed out, the Motor Vehicle Act is currently 175 pages, and somebody in the Legislative Library's printer doesn't print double-sided, by the way, just so you know. The thing is that it would be interesting to know how much shorter this would be if we removed the sections that no longer applied, or really were redundant, or were covered in other acts. So, Mr. Speaker, I think with that, I will take my place. I'm sure that, however, I'm sure that after hearing the remarks of my other colleagues, and hopefully maybe some on the other side of the House, that I might be inspired to stand again and speak a bit more. And hopefully the real issue at question will get sufficiently resolved for consultation that we won't have to keep doing this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I now recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very happy to stand and speak for a few moments. A few moments. No, I'm not going to say spandex. Thank you very much to the Deputy Government House Leader for keep people in rein there. I know the Speaker, I know the Chair could probably do that too. Mr. Chair, it's a pleasure to see everyone here tonight in this late hour. And I know everybody's looking forward to our visit tonight with the Taste of Nova Scotia. And I know that's coming up in about an hour and 15 minutes. So I want to try to keep my remarks under that time. And well, I doubt it'll happen sooner, but ultimately, here we are talking about an act to amend Chapter 293 of the revised statute of 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is what, the third Motor Vehicle Act one that we were doing today, or doing during this sitting. All of them have been very short Motor Vehicle Act amendments, some that I think warrant individuality, and others that, probably could have gone along with something else. Mr. Speaker, Bill 103, in its basic essence, speaks to a letter that individuals would receive as a warning when 4 or more demerit points are entered on a person's driver's record. Mr. Speaker, I wonder for the individuals that are watching Ledge TV and the people in this House of Assembly, do they actually know how many demerit points or what their driver abstract actually says? I would probably guess that most people have no clue. Mr. Speaker, and I can say even before my time as an executive assistant, being able to participate in some activities at Business and Consumer Services at the time, I had no idea what an abstract was. I knew they probably had a little bit of a file sitting somewhere as of all the bad things that Christopher Dottema did, but I'm not too sure that that there was a thing called an abstract. Mr. Speaker, and let's talk about my driving record for a bit. My driving record, just to give you some context of why this is probably not that important to me, really revolves around the issue of never have had a true speeding ticket. Now, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, I know that. Can you imagine? I have been driving since the age of 16. Luckily, thanks, and I thank my parents for allowing me to take a car or the truck at that point and being able to be a driver, to go off to driver's ed. Had a wonderful school teacher that helped me out during that one. Those driver's ed teachers have nerves of steel to be able to do that. I know the member for Guysborough is shaking his head because I think he probably did that along his career as an educator. Mr. Speaker, we were able to move on and I think being a relatively reasonable driver in that time. The experience that I have with a speeding ticket revolves around one day. I was working at the time for TriStar Industries, working in the computer section of the business and doing helping out with the cell phone sales at the time. And every year, MT&T at the time, or our new Bell Alliant, would have a mobility sort of party gathering, and they would offer some nice certificates, some nice prizes for individuals who sold a certain amount of cell phones and signed up individuals on their new mobility system. This is back in the mid to late 90s. Mr. Speaker, Larry Monroe and I picked him up in Wentworth, and if you know, my house to Wentworth is probably on a good day, it takes you about 12 minutes to get to his house. And it took a little bit longer because it was snowing that day. They always seem to pick sometimes in the winter for these gatherings here in Halifax. And so drove up the 101, which is odd for me because normally I would drive the 103 to Halifax because it is a shorter route from the wonderful constituency of Argyll. But if you're coming from Yarmouth, you can sort of take those two things. So Wentworth is on the other, or Wellington is on the other side of Yarmouth. So went off, picked up Larry, and we made our way to Halifax via the 101. Now, it snowed the whole darn way, and if you know what it's like driving on a highway in a snowstorm, you're lucky if you can make, I don't know, 50 clicks an hour or less. So if you can imagine the 3-hour drive or 3.5-hour drive that would normally take that 3.5 hours probably took us 6 hours to do. Now, here you are just eking along, and I made it to just about, just past Grand Pre, where the two bridges are there, the two steel bridges are. And it actually cleared. I couldn't believe it. It was like finally, after driving for 3 hours and just making it there, it finally cleared. And I'm thinking, great, I can make a little bit of the time that I've lost to try to get to Halifax in time for this awards banquet. Well, god darn, there is the police sitting there. I believe right there, the Gasparol. They're right there, and they get me driving along at I don't know. I was probably going 112, so it wasn't like I was going fast, but it was above the speed limit. And this officer that day felt that I was going too fast for the conditions of the road. It just happened that I had been driving in such horrible weather that this was a really great improvement over what I had been doing. So he pulls me over, and of course at the time I had a sign on the side of my car. I'm a salesperson, so I'm selling everything that I can. And he sees that I need my car to drive, and this officer was more than accommodating, and did end up giving me a ticket for failure to abide by posted road signs. Now, if that's the kind of speeding ticket that you want, that is the kind of speeding ticket that you want, because that ticket does not limit your driving time, meaning you don't have to take that whole week off, nor does it take any points or put any points on your record. That is the only time that I can say that I've been basically stopped for speeding. There's been a couple of warnings along the way, but then again, for the quantity and the time that we spend on the road, we as MLAs, it's a surprise that many of us don't have speeding tickets going back and forth. And I know the previous member for Yarmouth, I tell you, I think probably pleaded it a number of times to the RCMP, and he's explained it on a number of occasions how it is driving back and forth from Yarmouth, that going a little fast is almost necessary in times and be able to make it for meetings. Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, I can say that I too drive a little fast sometimes. I try my best to abide by the road signs, but can you imagine? Yeah, I'm indicting myself here by saying it. But I can say that many times, that's right, I'm saving the chamber. I could actually say that, that's right. But Mr. Speaker, I can say as you're driving up the 103 through the wonderful South Shore, through the beautiful counties of Shelburne, the beautiful counties of Queens, into the Lunenburgs, that there's not necessarily a complete highway through that area. And I can say that there's places where the 100, 110 number works fine, and there's other places that they don't, like Southwest Port Mattoon, that the Honourable Minister of Fisheries is indicating as he's listening to me. I've been told by the Minister of Fisheries and Environment. And I can tell you, as you get into those sections of road, you know, you could be listening to the radio, you can be paying attention to the beautiful scenery, You could be talking on your cell phone, on your hands-free headset or your Bluetooth system that's in your car. But I can tell you, sometimes your attention is not quite where it needs to be even when you're doing those things. I know they're illegal. I know they're illegal, but then again, they do still take some of your attention away from what you're supposed to be doing. And I can say driving through some of those slower sections of the highway, meaning 80 to 90 in some of those cases, and then it goes clunk down to 60 as you go through Port Mattoon. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm very happy that the provincial government, under our government, with the federal government, and re-announced as well by this government, is the bypass of Port Mattoon. And I figure I'm going to at least stay in the House and try to continue to be an MLA in this House to see the completion of that bypass. Now, Mr. Chair, my experiences with bypasses in this province are varied. I've seen some things happen very quickly, and I've seen things happening very slow. And I know the member for Shelburne, the Honourable Minister of Fisheries, can look at the experience of the completion of the Barrington bypass. And I believe the original survey work began in 1972. 1972, and I was very glad to be on that road and open it up as much as you can open up a road. When was it? I'm just trying to think. It was 2008, 2007, I think. You know, it finally opened. But Mr. Speaker, you know, really, or Mr. Chair, going really right back to it, it's the issue that with the thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers that I've driven in my career, I am lucky, and I'm going to knock on wood here. I'm going to knock on the wood that I have not had a speeding ticket. The Minister of Service Nova Scotia is knocking on her head, and I'll do the same because there is a lot of wood between my ears, or at least that's what my mother says in most cases. Mr. Chair, to the issue of the bill. And, you know, and the member for Clare said it very well when we did start off debate and here in Committee of Whole House, is most people wouldn't understand what they're reading here. I mean, what does it mean, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act? Now, last time I checked, and you know, everywhere I visited within my communities, I don't remember seeing a coffee table book called the Motor Vehicle Act sitting there, nor did I see a document with a whole bunch of little tabs that people use on a regular basis. The Motor Vehicle Act, in most cases, to a Nova Scotian, is more of a concept. It's more of a, you know, it's something that sits somewhere. So they probably don't even know where it really sits, where it resides, how it came about, and really what it does. Mr. Speaker, I can say that even as an MLA here for the last 7-some years, I can't quite tell you what all the provisions within the Motor Vehicle Act. I haven't been lucky enough to be the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. I haven't been lucky enough to be the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations. And I can say that as much as we have an idea that it's about vehicles and roads and safety, it's really hard to say what it is. Mr. Speaker, this bill, in its simplicity, talks about a letter that Nova Scotians are to receive to warn them when they have gotten infractions when it comes to 4 or more points are entered on the person's driver's record. Mr. Speaker, if we're removing that requirement and that aid to Nova Scotians, what are we replacing it with? Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chair, it's a difficult thing. You know, I was talking to an individual in our caucus, Mr. Rob Smith, and I really enjoy talking to Rob and the information that he brings. And he was talking. He said, you know, listen, that provision has come in handy a couple of times for him because, you know, you can get the ticket and you sort of forget this other stuff, and it makes you drive a little more cautiously during your period of numbering until you have those numbers or those points taken off your system again, off your abstract, so that you're sort of free and clear to maybe add a couple more points to your abstract as time goes on. And I think maybe in most cases, people kind of forget. You get your original ticket, you know, you don't contest it. I don't know how many people have actually contested a speeding ticket, but I haven't talked to too many. You know, you go in, you pay it, and you move on. And most people would sort of forget that, well, wait a minute, I had points taken off or points put on, or whichever. I've been through two systems in my driving career, so I apologize if I'm taking off or putting on. But, you know, people kind of forget as their lives get busy and don't realize that, you know, maybe the next speeding ticket, they'll lose their license for a longer period of time. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, keep going to Mr. Speaker, just a habit of standing here and talking to reference the Speaker, but Mr. Chair doing a wonderful job there. You know, ultimately, if we're replacing it with something, what are we replacing it with? I know we're in a world of technology, a world of emails and Twitters and Facebooks and the like. So I'm wondering, and I wonder out loud, and I know the minister's listening, you know, what is the replacement? Is there an email field within your abstract that maybe when you sign up, again, you renew your license, that you add an email number into it, that maybe you could receive an email once a year, say, hey, good job driving this year. There are no infractions. You've done this. Good job. Keep up the good works. Or, hey, we saw that you were speeding the other day. By the way, you have four points on your system. Please try to smarten up a little bit. You know, and I know in a way, you know, we would say there's Big Brother telling you what to do again, but you know, we do have the electronic capabilities to do things like that. Mr. Speaker, the previous speaker, the member for Dartmouth East, was sort of talking about the capability in the police cruiser in order to do some of these things, not all of these things, but some of these things, especially when the entering of information for your ticket. You know, at this point, the RCMP officer, in most cases, and from my experience from riding along a couple of times, you know, picks up his or her tickets at the detachment, puts them in their little folder, head off for an evening of checking the roads and doing policing in those communities, and you know, pull over a person who is speeding or has done some kind of motor vehicle infraction, whether it's driving through a stop sign or you know, even as far as having lights out in their vehicle. So take that information and enter it into a computer. Today's police cruisers, of course, are equipped with some great pieces of technology. For a moment. Have the technology, of course, have computers on board. You know, in the time that I remember driving along with RCMP, you actually called in a license plate, and you would be able to get some of the information off, or you would drive in, you would give the information number off of the driver's license, and then be able to tell you the information from the computer system in the centrally. But anyway, today that happens on the cruiser. The cruiser can then tell you, the computer can tell you, show you your abstract, and the RCMP officer, the police officer in Nova Scotia, would you know, look at that and make a decision on whether the individual needs a ticket, or maybe just needs a warning, or you know, or can move on with a bit of a verbal warning. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, why not utilize this system to swipe the card? I mean, we do have swipeable licenses today with the digital information on the back of it. That information would be entered in, of course, the system, cross-checked with the computer system, and it would show. You could possibly find or mandate a way to have an electronic capability for your insurance. We know that insurance companies, even at this point, do receive abstracts for their drivers. So that could be cross-referenced. The information, of course, on your vehicle registration could also be scanned in a way. I mean, today, not only with digital information of swiping with that information, of course, we have scannable UPC codes. So, why not use that kind of information? I mean, the federal government uses UPC codes now when you fill out your passport. As a matter of fact, it's really kind of neat that if you do an electronic passport, it does create a very interesting looking. I mean, I don't understand the technology behind those UPC codes, but that UPC code has your information in it. So really, all they end up doing when you bring your information into the passport office is scan it. So why can't we have that stuff on a police cruiser? Oh, man, and as a matter of fact, I know I can take my iPhone, I can download an app on it, and it'll scan a number of things, UPC codes off of products in a grocery store. It'll actually scan stuff off of the Metro newspaper. If I'm interested in that file, I can take a picture of it basically with that scanner. It will bring up the actual electronic copy of that article. So what I'm trying to say here, Mr. Chair, is that technology is available to us, and if not, cheap enough that we could have it in our cruisers, so all of that documentation can happen, instantaneously. So we could print out, Mr. Chair, a digital ticket, a ticket on the sheet, no differently than a parking ticket that we have here now in the HRM. If you notice, the meter people, I don't know what you call them now. I guess years ago you called them a meter maid, but that's not right. They're called a meter person or a officer, or I'll have to have someone correct me at some point on that one. But they walk around with their little handheld devices. They put your number in, out comes the ticket, and they put it on your wiper for you to bring home and head off and pay your $15 within a few days, or pay more if you don't pay it within your number of days thing. So why can't the information be available to the RCMP officer, police officer, as they're doing their check with you, and then print out a ticket, 2 copies, one for you, one to pay at the tech cashier, with basic information of your abstract right on that ticket. Then, Mr. Chair, is that you don't need the letter. You're providing the driver with a tangible piece of information about their driving record, about their abstract. So Mr. Chair, I could say that would be a reasonable replacement for these letters that the minister wants to not send. I mean, to basically stop sending to the individuals. Mr. Chair, I think there's a lot to be said about small bills, and we need to make sure that they have their full airing. And also, Mr. Chair, is to sort of ask the question of who asked for this? I'm wondering what should. I hear the member. That just popped out of nowhere there. I'm glad someone's listening. I'm hoping that the opposition or that the government party is listening to every word that I'm saying. And you know what? I find it very interesting that the Minister of Finance is just hanging off every word that I'm saying. I'm impressed. I would figure that he's got a budget to get under control and get it back to balance, and he could be spending his time there. And Mr. Chair, I think, knowing that he's a family man, that he could head off and spend some time with his children too. I would have absolutely no problem with that, because we will be talking about this for a bit longer. There you go. Okay, no, I'll try. And I know that the member for Halifax Atlantic as well is very interested in this topic. just by her blurting of trying to help me out and trying to ask him more questions when it comes to Bill number 103. I wasn't the minister. Wait a minute, I wasn't the minister. I know the member for Halifax Fairview was trying to rabbit track me on, but I was, like I said in my previous, apparently he wasn't listening to me, because I was saying that I was never lucky enough to be the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations, nor was I lucky enough, and I look to the minister now, to be Minister of Tourism, of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. But I know many of us wanted to be Minister of Tourism, our Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, but lucky enough I was Minister of Agriculture. I want to thank the current Minister of Agriculture for that, because we spent lots of time debating things about agriculture in this province. And I was lucky enough to be the Minister of Health. I was lucky enough to be the Minister of Community Services, and a whole bunch of other little things that fit along into those issues and things that I dramatically enjoyed. Mr. Chair, you know, but what the point is that I know the member for Halifax Fairview, the Minister of Finance, said, well, why didn't you do anything about this? Well, who talked to us about this? I as an MLA, have never gotten a phone call from a constituent and said, boy, gosh, I got a letter from the department that warned me that I only had 4 points. What are you going to do about it? Because Mr. Chair, that's what motivates, I think, a lot of times when it comes to legislation. It's an issue that is impacting one of our constituents or a number of our constituents. Mr. Chair, I've never received a phone call of this one, nor can I say, Mr. Chair, have I received it any other ways that, gosh, you should send me a letter. So I'm sort of a split mind on this one, that I don't know whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. And nor from the explanations that we have received in regards to Bill number 103 of whether or not there is a true cost savings to not sending these letters out to Nova Scotians. Do we send thousands of these letters? Do we send hundreds of these letters? Or do we send just a handful? I mean, I don't recall from the presentation whether or not we did, but Mr. Chair, it begs it begs a question of why was this brought forward? And it's difficult sometimes too to know what's a good piece of legislation and what's not. When it comes to Bill 103, I can ask that question, because I am of two minds of whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. You know, being a driver for as long as I've been a driver, I can say that I've been lucky and what have you, except for the other night when I was on my way to the city a little late in the day. And just as I got down by Port Medway, I know where I turn in to go see the member for Queens. I know she just lives down in that neck of the woods as well. There was I wasn't coming to visit. I was just going by, but I do know you live down in that area. But it was 11 o'clock at night, so it wouldn't have been polite. It wouldn't have been polite to stop at that time of night. No, I don't know if you would even open the door. But I'm sure you would have. In the middle of the day, what the heck. But I was driving on my way to the city, so that puts me approximately halfway. That's my halfway point. When I know I've gotten there, I know that I'm at sort of the point of no return. I could stop at Liverpool, and I could actually turn around and head back home, and no harm, no foul. But once I get past that point, I might as well just keep on trucking and get all the way to Halifax. But the point is that once I got to that point, I met up with a checkpoint, and got pulled off to the side by the checkpoint, and the officer, of course, checks my my vehicle, not the registration, what do you call them? The inspection. And the inspection, unfortunately, had been out for almost 6 months. So why didn't I get a letter for that? I mean, that would have been a good letter. By the way, your inspection is due. You should go get it redone. Bit of an oversight on my part. When you when you travel back and forth as much as we do, and you would figure in some cases that your car dealership would look at that and say, hey, by the way, you should do your inspection and get it done. But no, that didn't happen in this particular case. I mean, thankfully, it's not an offense that would do any points for me, but it did cost my bank account about $260 odd, I think, if I remember correctly, what that amount was. But again, to my point of maybe having an email plugged into the system, and in today, I mean, you would say, okay, everybody changes their emails. I mean, every day you hear somebody that's got a government email, or next day someone's got an Eastlink, and next day someone's got a Simpatico, or gosh, there could be a Gmail or a Hotmail built in. But ultimately, people today are finding ways to have emails over a long periods of time. I know I probably still have some of my original ones. I think I'm running 4 different emails right now, but ultimately they all get to me in one way or another. So why isn't that information built into my abstract so that warnings or updates or what have you, or even government communication could come through an email to you? And that would have warned me that, by the way, you know, you're now driving without an updated inspection. Now, thankfully, the inspection, of course, didn't take very long, and it did pass, and I'm very lucky that way. You know, I do know some people that end up having to spend dollars and dollars and dollars because they don't take care of their cars. But you know, ultimately, it's not an offense that I would have had any points added to my abstract. So again, Mr. Chair, Bill 103 is before us to get its adequate airing, to provide a more background to Nova Scotians so they understand why it's here today. Mr. Chair, they are probably also asking why, you know, what is this part of the process? And this part of the process is, you know, committee whole house on bills, and it does give us the opportunity to you know, bring our thoughts forward and make people understand you know, what goes into building a piece of legislation, and what, you know, we as legislators, I mean, we are all legislators. I mean, everybody here that's been elected to sit in this House have an opportunity in one way or another to look at a piece of legislation and comment on it. Mr. Chair, this part of the process also gives us an opportunity to propose amendments to it, or even change names of the bills that are before us. You know, and maybe you know, as time goes on in debate on this bill, maybe I'll come forward with a bit of an amendment to change the name of the act to something that may be a little more understandable by Nova Scotians, and it's you know, it could say to no longer receive letters from the Department of Service Nova Scotia Municipal Relations in regards to your driver's abstract, or, you know, so you don't receive a letter from us to warn you that you shouldn't have another speeding ticket for a while. Or maybe it should be, you know, the Motor Vehicle Act that is too complicated for people to understand. Or, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that you could do to make this act, you know, a little more full, one that would explain the actual inner workings of this bill, ones that you know, maybe there's other letters that people are receiving that they don't require, or, you know, or maybe there could be a regulation setting right within this that, you know, the next time the minister or any one of the ministers that have their hands in the Motor Vehicle Act could set a regulation and make their own decisions in cabinet, which, Mr. Chair, does happen a lot. There is a lot of regulation setting laws that allow order in council, which means cabinet, to make a recommendation like this. Mr. Chair, many times we put some things in legislation that, you know, and I don't know when that piece of legislation was, or that piece of the legislation was put in. I mean, we're talking about the revised statutes 1989, which would lead you to believe that that amendment or that line was added back in 1989. But we're not sure. That might have been something in previous revisions of the Act. And we know that Acts continue to be either revised or added or amended during their lives as pieces of legislation. And Mr. Chair, the member for Dartmouth East as well was talking, is there more pieces within the Motor Vehicle Act that are outdated? And if there are, then why weren't they struck in this piece of legislation? Why are we going to have to, at some point, have to go back at this and spend all this time again to do a very simple amendment, to do a very innocuous thing that is not overly important to the majority of Nova Scotians. Mr. Chair, I know the member for Richmond, and I also believe that the member for Cape Breton North talked about the other things that we should be talking about rather than talking about these little tiny clauses and little tiny bills that are before us in this legislature. Things like back to balance. What does that really mean to Nova Scotians? Why is this budget in a mess? Really why? Mr. Chair, I'll tell you why, is because the Minister of Finance piled a whole bunch on it and blamed it on someone else. It was his opportunity to do that. Why aren't we standing here talking about public housing and finding ways to renovate existing stock that is across Nova Scotia? I know there's been a number of funding programs, and the Minister of Community Services could be talking about the good work that her department is doing, that I know is doing, and could live up to the amount of work that was done. You could talk to the housing stock that should be added to our system, so that Nova Scotians have a safe and warm and acceptable place to live and have the right to live. And I know over in over in law amendments right now, they were talking to the Tenancies Act, and that was a very interesting discussion to find exactly what they mean by a tenant. What does what's a landlord required, and how do they get through some of the issues in order to provide safe housing for all of their tenants. So I thought that was a neat discussion, and one that Mr. Chair, that we should have in this legislature. So I'm hoping, as time rolls on, that the Tenancy Act will hit here and will take the same amount of time that we're taking now on that act. But not until we're finished on this one. Mr. Chair, the Motor Vehicle Act again is one that is huge. I forget how many pages. I know the member for Dartmouth North. How much?
175. It's Dartmouth East.
Sorry, why do I keep calling that? I keep making that mistake. It's a lot of pages with a lot of drafting gobbledygook in it. There probably is a whole bunch of other stuff in there. Here, thank you very much to the member for Dartmouth East. The Motor Vehicle Act. It's the whole thing. And again, if we can look at it when it was amended and what sections in it, and the regular Nova Scotian could look at this and not really figure how this really applies to their daily lives. But we do know how important being able to drive or have a car is to the majority of Nova Scotians. I think half the time that most households now have two cars. You go visit somewheres, whether it's a hockey game or go to the theater or something like that, and you see parked in the parking lot, you see a ton of cars with half the people. It seems like people are driving two cars to work in some cases now. That's how important motor vehicles are to this society that we're in today. Mr. Chair, I wonder sometimes too is the dependency that we do have on motor vehicles. It's a way of life in the rural areas. I know, Mr. Chair, in your area, there's not a lot of transit. I know in the beautiful constituency of Argyll that there's very little transit. Matter of fact, I can say there's almost none, except for the Hope van that does come out to help people that are handicapped or visually impaired in order to get them back and forth to work. But you know, if I wanted to take a bus into Yarmouth, that can't be done. So there is a huge dependency on vehicles, especially in the rural areas. Now, what surprises me is how dependent people are on motor vehicles here in the HRM. I try my best. I try my best that when I come to the city, I come at a non-traffic time, because oh my goodness, it's really hard to believe. When I come up the 103, and you know, and I'm unlucky enough that I'm hitting traffic areas somewhere near 8 o'clock in the morning. I hate going down the St. Margaret's Bay Road and then hitting the Rotary, because I know that it just took me 2.5 hours or more to go from the southwest corner to the Halifax boundary. And then it probably is going to take me a half hour, 45 minutes to go from exit 2 or exit 1, whichever one it is, to get down here. I mean, there's many mornings that I've hit that because of that volume of vehicles that are coming from the bedroom communities of Halifax, whether it's the Timberleys or the Tantallons or where Seabright or all those areas. I mean, people do drive in from Halifax to Halifax from places as far away as Liverpool in some cases. They come in from Lunenburg, they come in from Chester, and they all sort of meet up at the same time. But that's the kind of stuff that this act should be addressing is transit, and not just the motor vehicles that are required in order to provide a job, to provide sustenance to your family. I mean, that's what a vehicle is in a lot of cases, to get you into work so you can work and get you back home in a decent time. The Motor Vehicle Act really doesn't speak to a lot of those things. You know, it could, you know, if we did look at another revision. I mean, a true revision of the Motor Vehicle Act, like I said, hasn't been done since 1989. And if I look at the, you know, just the amendments that have happened since that time, Mr. Chair, there was an amendment in 1990, there was one in 93, and I could list off the sections that were amended, but I'm going to start from that. 94, there was amendments, 94, 95, 94, 95 again, 94, 95 again, 98, 99, 99, 2002, 2002, 2002, 2002, 2003 in the second session. Not only in the first session, but the second session. Yeah. 2004, so I was around for that one. 2004, 2004, 2005, 2005, 2005. Though I'm sure there's one of them in that is booster seats, which was the member for Halifax Clayton Park that would have brought that one forward, and the government was good enough at that time to herald it through. And it was Ron Russell, a tremendous MLA for Hants West. You know, he was a great minister of transportation as well. Going on, there was another one in 2005. So really, 2005 had 4 amendments. 2006, there was 3. 2007, there was 3 amendments. You know, it seems like every year. 2008, there was 4, 5, and there was 3 amendments in 2009. And we know already, I think, in this sitting, we've seen 3 amendments to the Motor Vehicle Act. So maybe, Mr. Chair, the time is, and not that I'm sure the Minister of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal nor the Minister of Service Nova Scotia really wants to take on something like that, but you know, maybe it's time to look at a review of the Motor Vehicle Act. And you know, I'm betting there's still some stuff in there that dates back to its original introduction, and I'm wondering what year that was introduced. But you know, I'm going to bet it's a lot older than I am, and it's a lot older than anybody in this house, if not 100 years old. So Mr. Chair, that is what I'm saying. Rather than these tiny little amendments, maybe we should move on and be able to provide a true and understanding act that Nova Scotians can grab onto and understand what their provincial government is doing for them and doing to them, because there's many things in here that enact a law or regulation that provides infractions and thou must not do. So, Mr. Chair, you know, as I hopefully work my way home in the next number of weeks, I'm hoping the roads are going to be clear and dry, and I'm hoping that the weather will be good, Mr. Chair. As I travel back down that 103, back to the member for Dartmouth East, I can give him back his copy because I really don't need all this. It's getting heavy in my arms. You know, I'm hoping that as I drive back down through the wonderful communities. Did I just see that? I'm just saying, you know, as much as you're not supposed to talk about what goes on in this house, but I think I just saw for Cape Breton Nova kiss the Minister of Transportation on the forehead. And I just wanted, I wanted that to be, that's one of those things that really, really, really needs to be enhanced. Because I'm just wondering, you know, I'm thinking, oh, that's right, there's no hands right now. Ah, shoot. Maybe in third reading, I'll be able to talk about the kiss I just saw. The kiss I just saw. He's looking for something there, I think. But I don't think the member for Cape Breton Nova has a whole lot of provincial roads there, so I wonder what he's going after. The member for Pictou East just moved on into the scene, and he's speaking sweet nothings into the ear of the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal. So just to start to sum up, and hoping that the next speaker is ready to fly. You know, we don't necessarily disagree.
Much more elegant.
Don't necessarily disagree with what we're seeing in this bill. We're saying that it probably should have had more substance in regards to what's held within the Motor Vehicle Act. There's probably a whole bunch of other outdated things that we could probably do to save time and red tape for Nova Scotians. And we would hope that, you know, that there can be a little more consultation when we really open up an act like this and try to provide. But like I said, as I'm driving my way down the 103 the next few times, I'm hoping it's going to be a good, dry and clear ride, as I hope that it is for everyone. Because as much as we may oppose ideas, sometimes I wish everybody the safest drive that they can, and I'm hoping that they stay within the speed limits and don't need to have any points added to their system, because that's just being a little naughty. So thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll take my seat, and if I feel that I'm, charged up again to talk about this, I'll be happy to spend a bit more time at this one. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
I recognize the member for Bedford Birch Cove.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased to rise today to have my input on the bill before us on the Motor Vehicle Act amendment. And I thought I would talk a little bit about motor vehicles in Canada and really what our history has been around the different car companies in this country over the past really a couple of hundred years. It may interest you to know that there have actually been 500 different car companies that have called Canada home. Most of them plied their trade in the early 1900s. And pretty much all of them were actually Canadian owned. In fact, between 1918 and 1923, Canada was the world's second largest car maker and a major exporter. By 1925, the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, controlled 3/4 of the American car market. At the same time, consolidation was happening in Canada too. And it would have meant the death of the Canadian auto industry had the federal government not entered the picture. The government slapped a tariff of 35%, thank you very much, of 35% on cars made in the U.S. and sold in Canada. And that move actually persuaded the companies to build some of their vehicles north of the border. In 1926, the tariff was eased, but most cars sold in Canada had to have some Canadian content, and that move was actually a boon to the Canadian auto parts industry. Canada also proved to be a convenient conduit for American companies to sell their cars to the British Empire. High tariffs discouraged direct sales from the United States. And I should note that I'm getting most of this information from CBC News. They have a report on their website on the auto industry, just so I make sure I give proper credit where credit is due. By the mid-1930s, evolution and the realities of a small domestic market actually took their toll, and the Canadian-owned car company was extinct. The industry, on the other hand, was booming. In the 1920s, jobs in the Canadian auto industry doubled to 16,000. And Windsor, Ontario, the heart of the Canadian auto industry, saw its population increase fivefold from 1904 to 1929. And I actually have a family connection with this because I was born in Chatham, Ontario, and a lot of my Eastern European ancestors either moved to Windsor or to Detroit, the Detroit area, to work in the auto industry. And so I have a lot of American relatives who live in Michigan whose grandparents actually were part of the auto industry. Canadian auto output was about 170,000 units in 1927 and 24,000 units in 1928. In January 1929, just under half the cars built in the country were made to be exported. By 1940, auto plant production was turned to military purposes as the Second World War raged. Canadian auto plants were turning out about 600 armored personnel carriers a day. And I would assume that many of those workers in those plants would have been women whose husbands had gone off to war, and so that's when we had our own version of Rosie the Riveter. When the war ended, the plants quickly switched back to peacetime production, and by 1953, 20 automotive plants employed 33,000 people and produced 360,000 cars and 120,000 trucks. It was still just a slice of the North American industry. But then there came a rough patch. By 1960, Ottawa again turned its eye to the health of the Canadian auto industry. Post-Second World War growth pushed the Canadian production to about 500,000 units, although growth was relatively stagnant in an otherwise booming economy. Because of high tariffs, vehicle prices in Canada were actually very high, and there were large and growing trade deficits, and the parts sector was actually in serious trouble. In 1960, the government established the Royal Commission on the Automotive Industry, led by Dean Vincent Bladen from the University of Toronto. Bladen's report recommended a continuation of Canadian content rules to protect the industry. The government rolled back some duties equal to the amount of Canadian content in a car. Now, American companies complained, saying the move was illegal under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. By 1965, the Canadian and U.S. governments headed off an automotive trade war and signed the Canada-U.S. Automotive Products Trade Agreement, or the Auto Pact. It established a conditional free trade zone for both vehicles and original equipment parts. Duties remained in place on aftermarket auto parts. Under the Auto Pact, car makers had to build as many vehicles in Canada as they sold here, and in exchange, the automakers were allowed to move their products across the Canada-U.S. border duty-free. The Canadian industry did far better than that. Vehicle production actually increased from 670,000 units in 1965 to 2.9 million units in 1988. Employment grew from 65,000 to 142,000, and the value of trade grew from $1 billion to $74 billion during that same period. The free trade agreement that came into effect on January 1st, 1989, effectively ended the Auto Pact. It did that by eliminating the penalty contained in the old deal. The Auto Pact remained on the books until 2001, when the World Trade Organization upheld a complaint filed by Japanese and European car makers. And they, in fact, argued that the pact was unfair because it allowed all vehicles from big U.S. manufacturers like Ford, GM, and Daimler Chrysler to enter the country duty-free, including European cars made by automakers owned by the Big Three. Cars made by companies like Honda faced a 6.1% tariff. There were fears that the death of the Auto Pact would have severe repercussions for the industry in Canada. And at that time, Canadian Auto Workers Union President Buzz Hargrove warned that thousands of jobs would head south to places like Mississippi and Mexico, where car companies could make their vehicles for less money. He also was concerned that too many foreign imports are sold but not built in Canada. The 1990s saw little growth in the Canadian auto industry. The expansion that had seen foreign car makers build plants in Ontario ended as older plants began shutting down. The end of the once popular Camaro, for example, meant the end of the line for GM's operations in Quebec. In 2004, the federal government and Ontario committed a combined $1 billion to lure new auto industry investment in Canada, and that was enough to persuade Ford Canada to commit $1 billion, including $200 million in government money, to expand its plant in Oakville, Ontario. In November of 2005, GM announced 30,000 job cuts in North America. And details then included plans to close plants in Oshawa and St. Catharines by 2008. And those two plants employed about 3,900 people, about 20% of Canada's automotive workforce. And GM attributed the losses to restructuring. GM said it was closing its number 2 plant in Oshawa because of overcapacity in the market. The plant produced the Pontiac Grand Prix and the Buick LaCrosse Allure models, and those models wouldn't be made after 2008. And as we now know today, the Pontiac brand has in fact been retired. However, the auto industry has kept going, and in fact, in 2005, GM announced it would roll out a redesigned Camaro in Oshawa, Ontario. And it's actually the Camaro I'd like to speak about a little bit, because those vehicles can often be a real magnet for, in fact, picking up points when you oh, not a chick magnet, no. Those can be a real magnet for police, actually. When I was, I guess I would have been about 26. My brother, who was younger than me by 10 years, got his license, and he was very excited. And he had his license for about 3 weeks when he managed to total my mother's car. And she was just about to trade it in on a new car, and she ended up actually getting more for the trade-in that he destroyed than she would have ever gotten for her vehicle. So my parents decided to go out and buy a Firebird. And so, which really annoyed the heck out of me, because here my brother had destroyed their last car, and he's riding around town in a Firebird, and I'm driving, some old beater at university. Anyway, no, he would have been, maybe, yeah, I guess he would have been 16. Anyway, within the next couple of years, I think my father racked up all the possible points you could have from speeding in this red Firebird, and actually had to take a little vacation from driving for a while. And so I just want to caution that if you're thinking of buying a Camaro or a Firebird or a sports car, you could look forward to losing some points, which really is what the subject of the Act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989 of the Motor Vehicle Act is about, and more specifically about not notifying people when they have achieved 4 points. Now, one would assume that if you are pulled over by a police officer, you would know that you have, in fact, lost points. But I can say I recently, actually, since starting this job, I had my first ever speeding ticket. It was, I probably could see it from here where I got it. So just be really careful as you're coming down that road down the street, because that's where I got nailed. And it was totally my fault. I had actually never been on that road when it wasn't full of traffic, and I didn't realize I had sped up to well over the speed limit. But I have no idea if I had lost any points. And perhaps a letter to people who have lost points is a good idea. And I mean, to this day, I have no idea if I've lost points or not. Maybe I guess I would have had a letter if I had lost points, but I doubt I would have lost 4, so maybe I wouldn't have had a letter. In terms of the car industry or the motor vehicle industry here in Canada, though, I probably should get back to that. Or not. One of the things that always sort of fascinated me growing up about motor vehicles is, in fact, that there was such a vibrant industry here in Canada. And if we look at the history of the Ford Motor Vehicle Company, it was, in fact, launched in a converted factory in 1903 with $28,000 in cash from 12 investors. Interestingly enough, 2 of those investors were John and Horace Dodge, who would later found the Dodge Brothers Motor Vehicle Company. So Henry Ford was 40 years old when he founded the Ford Motor Vehicle Company. And what that story tells us is how important startup money is for a company, and how important it is that, that people who want to start companies can find those angels to help them get their vehicle up and running early. And often we hear in Nova Scotia how difficult it is to find venture capital. And so it's interesting to note that back in 1903, how important that venture capital was for Henry Ford. And during its early years, his company produced a range of vehicles. And I think, we've all heard about them, the Model A, which was 1903. The Model K and the Model S, and actually the Model S was Ford's last right-hand steering model, and that was in 1907. The Model K was Ford's first 6-cylinder model, and it became known as the Gentleman's Roadster and the Silent Cyclone, which I quite like the name of, and it sold for about $2,800. And so that was about 2007, but the next year, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, and that really was the seminal vehicle of the last century. I think we've all seen the Model Ts, and we've heard about Model Ts, and they were produced at the rate of only a few a day at a rented factory in Detroit, and they would have about 2 or 3 men working on them originally. That's the way it went. The first Model Ts were built, I think in 1909, about 18,000 were built. But as demand for the car grew, the company moved to much larger plants, and by 1911, in the first year of operation at their new plant, they made almost 70,000 vehicles. And by 1913, it's fascinating, I know. By 1913, the company had developed all the basic techniques that they are so famous for, the assembly line and mass production, and really revolutionized production in North America. In fact, Ford introduced the world's first moving assembly line that year, and that reduced the chassis assembly time from 12.5 hours in October to 2 hours and 40 minutes very, very quickly. And then ultimately, they went down to actually 1 hour and 33 minutes. And it actually boosted annual output to over 200,000 units that particular year. So that would be 1912. And after a Ford ad promised profit sharing if sales hit 300,000 units between August 1914 and August 1915, sales in 1914 actually reached 300,000 and 500,000 by 1915. And by 1920, production would exceed 1 million a year. Now, actually, those innovations were quite hard on employees, and turnover of workers was very high. And then, while increased productivity actually reduced labor demands. Turnover meant delays and extra costs of training, and which meant that you would have slow workers replacing the old hands. So in January 1914, Ford solved the employee turnover problem by doubling pay to $5 a day, cutting shifts from 9 hours to an 8-hour workday and a 5-hour work week. And that also increased sales because a line worker could actually buy a Model T with less than 4 months' pay. They also instituted hiring practices that identified the best workers, and they actually went out of their way to include disabled persons considered previously unemployable by other firms. Employee turnover then plunged, and productivity soared, and with it the cost per vehicle plummeted. Ford cut prices again and invented the system of franchise dealers who were loyal to his brand name. And in fact, Wall Street criticized Ford's generous labor practices when he began paying workers enough to buy the products that those workers were actually making. Now, while Ford attained international status in 1904 with the founding of Ford of Canada, it was in 1911 the company began to rapidly expand overseas, with the opening of assembly plants in Ireland in 1917, England and France, followed by Denmark in 1923, Germany in 1925, Austria in 1925, and Argentina in 1912, and then they also went into South Africa in 1924. And Australia in 1925. By the end of 1919, Ford was producing 50% of all cars in the United States and 40% of all British ones. I had no idea that there were that many American cars in Britain at that time. By 1920, half of all cars in the US were Model Ts. The low price also killed the cycle car in the U.S., which I understand was actually one of the first cars that Ford had actually produced, I believe. And the assembly line transformed industry. Soon, companies without an assembly line simply risked bankruptcy. Of 200 U.S. car makers in 1920, only 17 were left 20 years later. The assembly line also transformed technology. Henry Ford is reported to have said, "Any customer can have a car painted any color he wants so long as it is black." Before the assembly line, Model Ts had been available in a variety of colors, including red, blue, green, but not black. Now, paint had been a production bottleneck. Only Japan black dried quickly enough, and not until Duco lacquer appeared in 1926 would other colors reappear on the Model T. In 1915, Henry Ford went on a peace mission to Europe aboard a ship, joining other pacifists in efforts to stop World War I. And this actually led to an increase in his personal popularity, and Ford would subsequently go on to support the war effort, with the Model T becoming the underpinnings for the Allied military. Vehicles like the Ford 3-ton M1918 tank and the 1916 ambulance. Interestingly enough, the Ford Oval trademark was first introduced in 1907. The 1928 model was actually the first vehicle to sport an early version of the Ford script in the oval badge. After World War I, Edsel Ford in 1919 succeeded his father as president of the company, although Henry still had a hand in. While prices were kept low through a highly efficient engineering, the company used an old-fashioned personalized management system and neglected consumer demand for improved vehicles. So while four-wheel brakes were invented by Errol Johnson and were used on the 1909 Argo, they did not appear in a Ford vehicle until 1927. And to be fair, Chevrolet waited until 1928. So Ford was steadily losing market share to GM and Chrysler as these and other domestic and foreign competitors began offering fresher automobiles with more innovative features and luxury options. GM had a range of models that went from the relatively cheap to some luxury ones, and so it was tapping all the price points in the spectrum, while less wealthy people purchased used Model Ts. The competitors also opened up new markets by extending credit for purchases, so consumers could buy these expensive vehicles with monthly payments. Ford initially resisted this approach, insisting such debts would ultimately hurt the consumer and the general economy. But Ford eventually relented and started offering the same terms in December 1927, when Ford unveiled the redesigned Model A and retired the Model T after producing 15 million units. And I think back to my grandparents who had a farm just outside of Chatham, Ontario, and for many, many years, they would not have had a vehicle to drive in. And I remember that my grandmother telling me about one political party that would offer them a ride to the polls every election time, and they would take a ride. And
But did they get any demerit points for that?
they did not get any demerit points for taking the ride. And when they would get to the polls, they would not vote as their car driver had expected. They would go in and vote Liberal. But anyway, I digress.
Digress closer to the bill. You digress.
Oh, no. I have actually spoken about those. I have actually spoken about demerit points.
They are good words.
Yes.
Nice font.
Yes, you know, it is a lovely font. The member from Dartmouth East has pointed out that it is quite a lovely font. And the 16 words there are quite lovely in their layout and their design. But anyway, back to the Ford Motor Vehicle Company. On February 4th, 1922, February 4th is my birthday. Ford, no, not 1922, just some days it just feels like that. Ford expanded its reach into the luxury auto market, and when it acquired the Lincoln Motor Company, named, of course, for Abraham Lincoln, whom Henry Ford admired.
Oh, well, there you go. I didn't
Well,
know
you see, there you go. There you go. The member for Digby the member for Digby Annapolis just indicated that he just learned something.
None of them over there knew it.
What are we going to debate?
The Mercury division was established in 1938 to serve the mid-price auto market, and the Ford Motor Company built the largest museum of American history in 1928, the Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford was a big admirer of Abraham Lincoln. He went on to acquire Abraham Lincoln's chair, the one he was sitting in when he was actually assassinated, and he acquired that from the owners of the Ford Theater. Abraham Lincoln's chair would be displayed along with JFK's Lincoln limousine in the Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village in Dearborn, known today as the Henry Ford. And in fact, when I was a child, I used to spend summers in Dearborn, Michigan, staying with some of my great aunts and uncles who had moved there to take part in the auto industry in Michigan. Michigan. I did. Yeah, thank you. Now, during the Great Depression, Ford, in common with other manufacturers, responded to the collapse in motor sales by reducing the scale of their operations and laying off workers. By 1932, the unemployment rate in Detroit had risen to 30%, with thousands of families facing real hardship. And I think that is something that parts of our province can certainly relate to today. And it's interesting, if you actually look at what is going on in Michigan now, they are seeing massive rates of unemployment too.
Order. Given the time, I would ask the member to adjourn debate.
Mr. Chairman, before we go, I would just like to mention that the last part of my remarks were okay. We're supported by research from Wikipedia, because I don't want anybody thinking that it came from me. Thank you.
Order. If the member could move adjournment, please.
I would like to move adjournment at this time, Mr. Chair.
The chair of the Committee of the Whole House on Bills reports
that the committee has met and has made progress and begs leave to sit again.
Thank you. The Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes government business for today. I ask that you now rise to meet again between the hours of 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., where after daily routines, we'll do public bills in Committee of the Whole, Bill number 103, 105, 106, 109, 110, and Bill 89, 102, 108, 111, 112, and public bills for second reading, Bill number 88, 121, 122, 123, 124, 125, 126, 127, and 128. So I ask now